Hello everybody and welcome to the inaugural All Analytics video chat. I'm your moderator, Michael Steinhardt, and we've got a fantastic topic today, building your case for visual analytics. Now joining us today are Beth Schultz, who's the editor-in-chief of All Analytics, and Mike Cavaretta, technical leader of predictive analytics at Ford Motor Company. Now let's just do a quick housekeeping note. Please remember that we're talking on screen with you, and we're also in the chat room at the same time. You can send in your questions while we're talking. We're going to try to address as many of those as we can during the live interview. Just in case we can't, we're going to stay in the chat room for an additional half hour. So we'll spend 30 minutes on screen, we'll spend 30 minutes in the chat room with you to answer additional questions, dive deeper into any of the topics that you want us to address, and to continue the conversation. Now, if you're a fan of All Analytics, you already know Beth, but just in case you're new to the site or new to the system, Beth is the award-winning IT journalist who runs All Analytics. She's a business expert with more than 2 decades of experience covering the industry. And Mike, I'll tell you a little bit about our special guest today. He is Ford Motor Company's data science leader. He's received a PhD in computer science in 1995, and he spent nearly 20 years applying data analytics to business problems. He's now the manager of the predictive analytics group at Ford's Research and Advanced Engineering division, and he's led many analytics projects across all areas of the company, including sales and marketing, warranty and quality, manufacturing, and HR. So Beth and Mike, welcome. We're really glad to kick things off, and let's get started.
Super, thank you.
Thanks, Michael, and welcome, Mike. I'm so glad you could join us today. You know, let's start with a little bit of scene setting, just so our viewers can understand what's forming your opinions on data visualization and visual analytics. So first, why don't you tell us about the data environment within Ford Research and Advanced Engineering? What kind of data are you dealing with? What kind of issues are you facing?
So we're facing a lot of interesting issues around different data types. As mentioned at the top, we have data coming in that we work on from all areas of the company. And this can be anything from traditional data exhaust from transactional systems to textual data to sensor data. And those all have their unique issues. I think it's also important to talk a little bit about how we're organized here on the team, and you can really think about us as being like an Ernst & Young, only just within Ford. So we have a lot of opportunities to apply these techniques in a lot of different business domains.
I like that idea, the data exhaust from transactional systems. I've never heard it quite described that way. But anyways, clearly very complex, big data situation on your hands. So now tell us, where does data visualization, visual analytics fit in for you? You know, is it a must-have at this point, or is it a nice-to-have?
So I think our perspective is really that the visualization techniques add so much that it's really very important in a data science effort to be able to use these techniques. And we really break things down into kind of a number of different categories, one of which is just understanding the data, like data profiling, generating some descriptive statistics and finding outliers. Also data exploration, so kind of get an idea about what the data can tell you across maybe pairs of different variables. Can you find something unusual? How do the relationships look? Are they more linear? Do they have some interesting tails to them? And then when you're developing your statistical model, the visualization can help a lot. Just plotting things like on a timeline can give you an idea about, are you hitting the peaks? Are you hitting the valleys? You know, are you hitting the trends in the data? How well is the model working? That you just really can't get from a simple statistic like an error rate or an R-squared or something like that. But I think really the key piece for us is telling stories with the data. So how do you synthesize what you have, your conclusions, in an easy to understand way? How do you present that to people who are, not statistically savvy per se, but know data, understand data, and have a really good feeling for the business? And that's really, I think, the key piece for us.
So let's look at that exploration piece of this first. So you yourself and your team using and your colleagues using visual analytics and data visualization. How has your use of this type of tool technology changed over the last, let's say, couple of years? I mean, has it grown? Has it gotten more sophisticated? Are you doing different things? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, sure. Actually, that's really interesting because we've started out a few years ago, probably 10, 15 years ago, doing a lot of stuff by hand, a lot of programming, a lot of kind of custom code. The tools have really progressed in that time, and the ability to be able to take much larger data sets, slice them and dice them, come up with dynamic dashboards, those are all pieces that have got significantly easier in the last few years. So from that perspective, it's been fantastic. I think the area that we've been particularly excited about has been the geographic information systems, the mapping, being able to present things in a geographic space to pique people's interest, to show them something that they can understand, as well as being able to present networks. So whether it be social media networks or supply networks, and look for clusters of things or choke points. Those are two areas that we've really looked at exploring in the last couple of years, and it's been very interesting.
Can you give me any examples of the types of visualization you've done and in a particular example of how it's kind of helped you find, predict, act on, make a decision more quickly?
So one of the things that we've looked at has been taking a look at people as they comment about their vehicles, what they're saying, and the connections to different vehicles. So what people are saying about different vehicles out in the social media space, and then being able to relate that back to different characteristics. So different attributes of the vehicle, whether they're talking about the fit and finish, they're talking about the ride, what are they saying, how does that relate to the vehicle itself, how does that relate to who they are and their experiences. So that's been one area that's been very interesting. And I think just the dynamic nature of being able to look at data across different internal sources and do data mashups, that's been very successful.
So you're combining the ability to do visual analytics with other sorts of analytics like sentiment analysis and link analysis or network link analysis.
Definitely, definitely.
And so now let's look at that other side of it, telling the story. I imagine that's as you deliver your results to the business, and how has their relationship with the data changed as a result of being able to see it, visualize it?
So I think we've really put in a lot of effort to try and tell the story through graphical representations. And we're all huge fans of Hans Rosling and his TED Talks and Gapminder, that the way he can tell a story with the data is absolutely fantastic. And we've tried to emulate that as much as we can. He is a rock star, so we're never going to get to his capabilities. But that's an area that we're really trying to work towards. The idea that you can take a conclusion that you generated through your analysis and then dynamically show people how you have generated your different hypotheses, answered different questions, and then kind of present your conclusions. And that's been very powerful for us.
So the business are you finding them more receptive to the insight that you're delivering, or are they able to find insight out of the results that you're delivering more quickly? I mean, how is it really kind of changing or reshaping the business?
So I think the biggest thing for us is our ability to be able to tell people a better story, to bring them on board with what we're doing, and answering their questions in a way that they can understand and make actionable. So I know that there are a number of different data science groups around that are looking at more self-service type areas. And there's a good amount of self-service kind of business intelligence analytics. But the areas that we generally get called in are more complicated, generally require much more in the way of connecting different data sources and building more complicated statistical models. And in those situations, you don't just want to throw up an equation and try and pull people through linear regressions or decision trees. What you want to do is you really want to show them hey, this is the data, these are the variables that are important, this is how they kind of relate to each other. And then, yeah, if we want to predict something that's going to happen in the future, this is kind of the way it works. The accuracy looks like this. And we're able to hit these highs and hit these lows and kind of build your credibility from there.
You mentioned Getminder, and I think you shared a couple of you shared some visualizations from Getminder that you found appealing, I guess, or doing a good job. Maybe we can show those now. Well, maybe as we're waiting for those, why don't you tell us, do you find that some data doesn't work well with visualization in that format? What does, what doesn't?
I think that's an interesting question. For the most part, the areas of visualization that are most important for us are really right at the beginning, where we're trying to get a handle on the data itself, trying to understand what the different distributions are and some basic relationships between them. And then at the back end, so kind of telling the story. The middle part is the part where you're doing your hardcore statistical analysis. That's the part where I think our experience has been the visualization isn't quite as useful. And I understand that there are some really good visualizations out there that can do multi-dimensional analysis. So you need to be able to present multiple variables in the same visualization. It's a lot of times it's very hard to be able to represent that in a way that's intuitive to people. And even with my group and with a lot of training, there's still some difficulties from that perspective.
So you've got to figure out which data to use in essence. And I understand the visualizations are up on the site. Is that right, Michael? Great. And so those are examples of visualizations that work well. Why don't you tell us about the difference between what we think of and hear when we hear data visualization versus infographics? Because I think there is a little bit of confusion with data visualization being such a hot and visual analytics being such hot topics these days. But what's the difference? What has changed here?
So I think our perspective over here is that when you're talking about data viz, that's more animated, slice and dice, being able to look at things dynamically. That's really very much the Gapminder type process. So you have something interactive, you can answer your questions, you can do change colors, change sizes of bubbles, run animations, do different things, being able to put all those things together to interrogate the data. And those can be very powerful. And I think that's really kind of the wave of the future with regard to tools. But if you're going to give a presentation and you're going to be giving it to the board of directors, it's fantastic to be able to do that. But if they want to reference that later, it's going to be very difficult for them to do that. And I think a lot of the stuff that goes on with the more traditional infographics that you see, let's say at the New York Times, where they can explain things with some graphics, with some charts, with some very tightly written text, and being able to put that together almost in a poster format, a lot of times that works really well because people can kind of get the whole thing all in one shot and then reference it later when they want to explain it to someone else. So I think the static versus the dynamic is a big deal. And they both have their place, but they're both very important.
And so are you saying that you use both in your work?
Oh, definitely, yes. I'm not going to say that we're to the level of the New York Times with regard to infographics. Those guys are fantastic. But we do deliberately think about how we want to make presentations. Do we want to leave something with people that allows them to be able to have everything in a unified view, more like a poster? Or do we want to tell the story with the data and then take people through different animations or slicing and dicing of the data and then kind of take them along the story? We're very conscious of that.
Are you talk about the importance of dynamic data visualization and interactivity. are the business folks that you're telling those stories to, are they also able to manipulate the data visualizations, change a variable here or there, or pull out a forecast, or is that something that only your team is doing at this point?
I think there are selected areas where the management, the people who we're working with in the company, they have access to tools and technologies that allows them to be able to do the visual analytics. I think in many situations, the places that we're brought into are areas where those kind of self-service slice and dice tools aren't getting them 100% of the answer that they're asking for. I mean, if they could do it themselves, they don't need our expert opinions and our assistance coming in.
Oh, we don't want that. I mean, you don't want that. So tell me how the process works. You sit down with the business owner or the business manager of a particular project and have the dashboard up, the visual analytics say dashboard up, and sort of let them ask questions, and you play with the data and show them the results?
Most of the time it's generated by a very specific business question. And, there's varying degrees of analytic capability out in the business. And generally there are a good number of people who are good at the basic analytics, the being able to slice and dice the data to take a look at various questions that the data can answer. And it's when people are getting together and they're saying, gee, we don't really have the data that allows us to be able to answer this other question. We can get halfway there, but we can't answer it ourselves. So we need to contract with the data science group over at research and then ask those guys, can they help us out? And so most of the time the engagements come out of questions that are generated by the business that they just can't support.
We hear a lot that visual analytics, data visualization helps the business and helps analysts themselves ask better questions, find questions to ask that they wouldn't otherwise have even thought of. Is that something you've experienced?
Yes, that's definitely something that we experienced. And I think the optimum situation, of course, would be to roll conclusions and the data mashups and the data sources back into the analytic tools and then deliver them back to the business. But that involves a cost, and it involves them making sure that they understand what the data is and how to be able to analyze it. And that's not always necessarily applicable when somebody has a very specific question that maybe has a short time associated with it.
So ideally, it's sort of an iterative process, but not always possible.
Definitely. It's definitely an iterative process. And most of the time the way things work is there's a particular question or question generated in an area. And once we've been called in and we understand what the questions are, sometimes there's new data sources that we haven't looked at before, but many times we have a good handle on what they are. Then we can come in and we can answer some questions very quickly, and then in an iterative process be able to say, if you want to answer questions in this area, you want to do a forecast, you want to predict it a certain way, you want to be able to understand how to get a better handle on what's driving your metrics, then we really need to kind of collaborate between the business and Ford IT and our group to say, hey, what's it going to take to be able to put this together into some type of system that can be much more self-service.
Did you have to, as you guys got more and more into visual analytics, did you have to alter your team makeup, bring in additional skills, or is it just sort of naturally flow from the talent that you had on board already?
We've got a really good team, and we have a lot of varied experience. So we have a couple people who have a very good computer science background, and so far we found that we've been able to kind of contain those new skills within the team.
When we think about infographics sometimes, and I say infographics more than data visualizations, but there is the tendency that to deliver something that doesn't quite tell the right story or tell the story accurately. Maybe a scale is misrepresented, or there's 110% in a pie chart or something like that. How do you make sure that what you are delivering in a visual way is absolutely accurate and can't be misconstrued in any way?
Boy, that's a real interesting question. I think from the team's perspective, we try and do a really good job of making sure that we validate our results. with other members of the team. And it's not necessarily a formal process. It's not like a code review, but it is something where we always want to make sure that we have fresh eyes on whatever results we send out and how we communicate our results. And that is very important. For the most part, I think since we've been doing this for so long, we almost are doing it intuitively. A lot of times when people are coming in with graphics or results where things just kind of look a little bit funny, then they're coming in from an outside organization, or maybe somebody who doesn't really understand how to use the tools that well. But most of the time, I think we do a pretty good job of representing the data in the appropriate way.
So the potential to possibly misrepresent the data would be one downside. Any other potential downsides of data visualization?
I think from our perspective, the complexity of the visualization is sometimes very, very tempting. So to be able to have something that puts everything together in one chart, one big graphic, so that you're showing the distribution, you're showing the forecast, you're showing 6 different variables that we think are going to drive what's going to happen in the future. And it's, for us, it's relatively easy to understand, but for somebody who hasn't lived with the data for the last 2 months, it can be very complex. And those are always situations that we try and watch out for.
So you deliver something, you layer that in, or you just pick 1 or 2 of those elements when you deliver the visualization?
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to what I was talking about before. So a lot of times we think very hard about what's the product that we want to deliver. So if we're making a presentation, we decide this is going to be more of the Gapminder animation, and we're comfortable with layering things on, then we'll make a determined effort to make sure that those pieces get layered on and that we are explaining things very clearly. So at the end of it, if it's a very complex visualization at the end of our presentation, that everybody should understand that. That's not necessarily going to work if it's going to be the more static infographic type. Mm-hmm. And in that case, we'll just simplify. Or maybe we'll try and put 4 of the pieces that we think are the most important and kind of do a 2x2 and just leave it at that.
So Mike, you've been doing this for a long time. What are some of your lessons learned?
I think the biggest lessons learned is know the audience. Definitely know the audience. Our biggest key is this: what do you want to leave your audience with if you're doing your presentation? And that means if they're going to be a group that can understand and you have enough time to be able to walk people through an animation, that's the one that we would rather do.
Okay.
Make it very interactive, make it very iterative, and those are the better presentations. People are engaged, they can ask questions, you can kind of slice and dice on the fly. Those are the ones that are the best.
It's not like, oh, here come the analysts again, huh?
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think the most difficult ones are the ones where you have to present something. You've got 10 minutes at a board meeting, and you've got to present your results on this thing, and you have kind of a complex situation. You want to make sure people understand the positive and negatives of your method, where it works and where it might not, and those can be very, very challenging.
So would you say visual analytics has been a game changer for your team?
Oh, definitely.
Okay. I mean, I know you've been doing it for such a long time, that might be a little bit tricky to answer because it's sort of standard fare for you guys now, right?
Right. I think there's one piece that we found really interesting, kind of an area of research, has been some of the thinking around, do you want to present things visually, or do you want to have a more kind of textual narrative against that? And where you're making recommendations in a way that's phrases, or to meet your cost targets, you need to remove 10 cents from every part. And is that a way to present results that are more understandable? And I think there are some interesting methods to be able to generate that, and I think your conclusions can sometimes really help narrow down those pieces. But for the most part, you're not going to be able to do that if you want to slice and dice the data. You're not going to be able to be dynamic and have that narrative there, and that's been the piece that we found really, really important.
So why don't we wrap up this portion of today's program with sort of the big question for I would assume for many of our readers, which is, they're just starting out here. So how do they sell this idea of visual analytics, the investment that it takes? How do they sell it to the business?
Well, I think the biggest thing, the biggest plus is to start small, to have some really good prototypes, some really good proof of concept. There are tools out there that are relatively inexpensive. There's the big three. There's Tableau, there's Spotfire, and ClickView. And those, you can buy a single seat relatively inexpensively. You're not going to break the bank. Do some experimentation and show people the results. Show them how dynamic those presentations and that the data can be. If you want to go even cheaper, there are some really good visualizations through the statistical tool called R, open source. It's going to take a little bit more because you got to do some programming, but the visualizations are pretty good and have some really interesting, like, let's say, network visualizations. Good stuff.
Okay, so I think that we have some questions from off of our text chat board. So why don't we take one or two here before we jump into the text chat?
Absolutely.
Michael?
Yes. First of all, thank you, Beth, and thank you, Mike, for all of your insightful discussion thus far. A couple of great questions have come in from the audience, and as I mentioned, we'll address at least some of them on the air, and the rest we'll address in the chat room, so don't go away. But one question that actually dovetails off what Mike was just saying is, who's doing the visualizations? Do you need a data expert to get involved? Do you need a visual artist to get involved in order to present something compelling to your given audience?
That's a really good question. Our perspective has been that for the more animation type, Gapminder, slice and dice type things, that we can handle that pretty well. There are high-powered power users out in the business who can handle a lot of those tools really well. I think the more difficult one is the really specific, well-done infographic, something like you would find in Time magazine or something like that, where you're going to be very focused and pull people through a process and explain to them something that they can then have on a piece of paper, stick it up on their wall, understand that process really well. And those situations, I think sometimes you need some specialized help. And, that's an area where I think bringing in a real graphic artist, somebody who has some real kind of training in that background, can be really, really successful.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Let's get one more in. Do you have any examples? Can you give us an example or two of Ford incorporating predictive behavior into the visualizations, or versus just static or historical data?
So when we develop our predictive analytic models for whatever we're going to be predicting in the future, we generally present them in a data visualization way. And many times those are incorporated into the internal Ford systems in different ways. It depends on the system itself. So it's really very dependent upon what the forecast is and the system that we're actually implementing it in, which unfortunately is not a great answer, but that's kind of where we're at right now.
But you're using what's the process in terms of the prediction engine versus the visualization part?
Well, so I think most of the time those are pretty separate, and we'll have a modeling tool, a modeling process, whatever that may be, whether that's R or SAS or the IBM tool, whatever those happen to be, and then bolted onto that will be a visualization tool. So generally, we don't have something that takes us all the way from soup to nuts in one tool. It's more like a best of breed.
Okay. And then for the presentation process, you've got the visualizations to make it more compelling and more accessible.
Right. And most of the time, that's based on what allows us to be able to present things in an engaging format, and it's kind of quick and dirty. So we want to be able to come back and have a number of quick iterations. So we don't really want to have a tool that requires 6 months of programming to get one visualization put together.
Got it. So speed is definitely of the essence. Okay.
Definitely.
Well, I want to thank Beth Schultz and Mike Cavaretta for joining us today. I want to thank everybody in the audience who came out with fantastic questions, a lot of which we weren't able to get to yet, but we still have another half hour in the chat room. Beth and Mike will be joining us, and we're going to take them as quickly and efficiently as possible. So keep the questions coming, keep the conversation going. For All Analytics, my name is Michael Steinhardt, and we'll see you in the chat room.